Hello, everybody. This is lesson 4B, and here we have more technology trends or technology change trends or adoption trends. These come from 2015 through 2017, whereas the previous lesson was through the end of 2014. This is Jeffrey Fox, your instructor slash speaker slash lecture developer, and it's the Big Data Applications and Analytics course. All right, after this overview slide, let's get on. This is a sort of interesting chart. All right, we're doing constant dollars. And we take the first 20 years of a technology. So the first technology is radio, which must be 1926. The next technology is TV, which is presumably sometimes after the war, Second World War. And the third technology is Internet. They don't actually tell you when they put the start, but Internet is actually now about 20 years old. So that probably started in the tracking in 1995. So anyway, you can just look at how fast advertising expenditure has risen, and you will see that Internet has risen much faster in 20 years than the radio did and the television did. We're showing that Internet-based media has grown much faster than the previous media revolutions. So that's sort of an interesting comment, both on the well, it's an interesting comment on how the internet media revolution is sort of different from previous revolutions. It's a much more intense revolution because it's been driven by such total changes in the way we do things. All right, so here we have a comment on the differences between different age groups, and you'll also have a nice definition of the different types of people. Generation Y, 81 to 99. I expect most of you are in that generation. Just some will be X, 61 to 80. Not so many, maybe none, in baby boomers. And then there's the silent generation born before 1944. And you notice no entry for 1944. That's sort of interesting because it's when I was born. So I'm not in any of these categories. Which means, and I can assure you that I would prefer internet, web chat, or electronic messaging, or actually a smartphone application. Any of the digital methods certainly would not like telephones, except as a final way of closing some deal or settling some other subtle thing going on. All right, so so here, here's 90%, here's 12%. But this is all connected with the same another feature that people are cutting off their telephones. They only have mobile phones, which you'll notice that's separate, and they're also, of course, cutting off TV. So people are cutting off traditional media outlets. All right. Here's why, if you were investing in the stock market, you should invest in Alibaba, not in Amazon or eBay. This is the plot of the share of the retail revenue in China and in the USA from Alibaba and JD, which are the Chinese leaders, and Amazon and eBay, which are two of the general purpose. Well, Amazon certainly is the general purpose leader in the US. Maybe eBay is number 2. I don't know where Walmart fits in here. It's certainly non-trivial. All right, so that just says that Alibaba is over 6.5% of the Chinese retail market, where at the same time Amazon was about half of that for the US. So China is becoming e-commerce faster than the US is, which is, again, not so surprising. The US has a wonderful non-e-commerce, wonderful commerce infrastructure which probably China doesn't have. And so that's one advantage of being a developing country. You don't waste your time on yesterday's technologies. All right. Here we have the number of internet users, which, as it's almost half the world's population, can't continue to grow, else it would exceed the population. But now it's got about a 12% year-over-year growth, which is pretty flat over the last 3 years, and it's up to a total of 3.3 million. I should say 3.3 billion, because these are thousands of millions. All right. So this is just showing that the internet is, well, since 2009, it's over doubled. So that's a pretty strong increase. And of course, most of that increase comes from China and India and places like that. Although actually this one removes India, I just see. All right, have to be careful. But China is certainly in here, and that's a large, probably a significant reason for this to grow. Yeah. All right, here is actually the amount of time people use or waste on the internet every day, and that is growing. This is hours per day, and it turns out that the typical adult user spends 5.6 hours per day on the internet, of which over 3 are on mobile, 2 are at the desktop, and 0.4 are on something else. Like kiosks or something like that. So this is, it's actually quite striking that so much is mobile, because you would think anybody who was in the business would not be on mobile. They'll be in the 2.2 desktop/laptop. All right, here we have online advertising, and that's it's increasing quite a lot. 50 billion up to 73 billion in 2016, with mobile actually sitting there at almost the same as desktop. Actually, mobile even looks a bit bigger, whereas in 2015, clearly 2015 mobile is significantly smaller than desktop. So there's been a dramatic switch. The desktop has gone down a little, and the mobile has gone up enormously. And of course, over here, desktop was just all there was. And, well, it has gone from 23 billion on the desktop to maybe 35, 36 billion now. So it's gone up from 2009 to 2016, but not nearly as much as the mobile, which has gone from 0 essentially in 2009, even though, of course, cell phones existed, but they weren't smartphones in those days. And now it's a huge amount of smartphone advertising. All right, here's an interesting plot of advertising versus time spent by potential people who will participate in the advertising. And there are two striking plots. One is this one, print, which shows that somehow advertising is 4 times more prevalent in print than it would seem need to be, given that 4% of the time is spent reading print, 16% of the advertising spending is in print. And that contrasts with mobile, which is 25% of the user interaction, but only 12% of the advertising budget. So that says that has to be readjusted. If you look at the other areas, TV is a little over emphasized. It's sort of curious that print and TV you would expect them to, because both the legacy media, that they would actually have the same mismatch between advertise and use. But somehow TV hasn't got this gross over expenditure on advertising. Even look, notice here the actual internet, the non-mobile internet, is actually got too much advertising. Although of course most of that should just switch to the mobile, which is also sort of the internet, so well, very closely related. And this is just reflecting the shift, a very rapid shift from desktops to mobile. All right, so the previous plot of this type went up to 2015 and had dramatic effects in print, which was 4% oversubscribed, and the internet, the mobile, which was 50% of the right value. And you can see actually dramatic progress has been made. Almost half the discrepancies being made up in the mobile, and the print is now 3 times oversubscribed rather than 4 times. Notice radio, TV, and the internet remain pretty much right on. So presumably we can expect this is a naturally aggressive capitalist system. It ought to be that requirements match expenditures because people will get most for their money that way. So we can assume that in the next couple of years maybe that this discrepancy here and here will actually continue to change in the way we've seen, and and then tend to equalize. All right, here we are. We're comparing now the advertising on the internet total versus the advertising on TV, and we can see they're crossing essentially. They've probably crossed already because we're in 2017, by which time it's expected the internet will be bigger than TV. So that's it's again not surprising. It's maybe even slightly surprising that TV has held on quite as well, because I must admit I never watch TV anymore. I terminated my TV subscription with the cable company, and my home just uses the internet. Here we have the global internet users. There are over 3 billion of them now, which is of course a pretty large fraction of the population, and that corresponds to a little less than 10% growth. This excludes India. If you included India, presumably it would actually enhance the growth, because India is obviously growing. India and China are responsible for a lot of the growth opportunities are in the India and China, which are large, technologically sophisticated countries. All right, here's the China internet use. Now notice this is China, so we're up to 700 million users in 2016. And that's a 10% year-to-year increase. And this is just the mobile internet, which of course is much more important than desktops in China, because China never had a chance to. China started expanding precisely when mobile started to expand, so they didn't get the large installed desktop or laptop or base or expectation of doing that. Here's an interesting plot of which is sort of, if you'd been predicting this 10 years ago, you might have got this wrong. Here is actual, real, physical things, trucks going on roads and delivering things to you. Here is the volume of parcels and packages. Here is the year-to-year growth, which is actually increasing. It's now at it's almost 9%. Yeah, 9%. And we're up to 10 billion parcels per year. And of course, that's due to the fact that they were buying electronically on, say, Amazon or Walmart For Alibaba, we're being delivered physically by FedEx, UPS, and DHL. And so that's producing this counterintuitive growth of an old technology, a truck or a van or whatever they want to use, because they use aircraft as well. Here's a final offbeat technology trend, programming languages. And it's really quite striking. This TIOB.com does this every year. And if you look at it, you'll find that C has done a particularly catastrophic drop in the last couple of years. Java has dropped significantly. C++ has slightly declined. And nothing else has changed dramatically, except there are a whole host of scripting languages, which are this stuff down here. And they are in total growing, so that the traditional mainstream programming languages, Java, C, C++, C#, C# is down here in the noise, are not so important any longer. Notice if you just go back to 2012, you have C#, C++ at 9%, and C and Java are now roughly equal. Notice now C is actually probably less than half of Java. So there's some big changes here. But still, the most important change is the growth of the scripting languages. And that is not in any one scripting language. It's not Python dominating. It's JavaScript, Perl, which must be going down, Ruby, PHP, Python, and Visual Basic. So there we are, end of this set of trends. Thank you very much.